Let's talk about the heyday of class struggle unionism. What are the class struggle traditions here in the United States?
Welcome back to Communists of America. This is part 2 of our episode on the U.S. labor movement. Part 1 will be in the description of this episode in case you missed that one. That one was focused on the resurgence of the U.S. labor movement today. In part 2, we will be hearing from people playing a role in the class struggle, some of our own comrades from San Diego, Phoenix, and Dallas-Fort Worth. But first, we are going to hear from Tom Trottier and Laura Brown on the history of the class struggle and the role of the communists in the United States.
Trotsky once said, the Revolutionary Party, the Communist Party, is the memory of the working class. And because in the United States we don't have a mass Communist Party, people are not aware of the real history of the American labor movement. So first thing I want to say is that, in spite of what the bourgeois academia has tried to, explain as the history of the labor movement, and even in spite of what the labor leaders who are pro-capitalist have said about the history of the labor movement, a lot of people may be surprised to hear this, but it's actually true, is that most major unions in this country either were founded or became powerful because of communists, socialists, and anarchists. It was the left that really built the trade unions, right? Whether you want to go back, for example, to Sam Gompers, who founded the AFL, when he was young, he was a socialist. He was writing to Marx and Engels. There was some correspondence. Now later he goes bad. Yes, that's true. But he started out that way, right? Then you can go into the traditions, for example, the IWW, Eugene Debs, and the railway union, and all you could have all these tremendous examples of people who had a big impact in helping to build labor. But of course, then you get into the 1930s, which in the 1930s, you have the birth of the major industrial unions like the UAW, for example, that came out of the CIO. And if you see in 1934, there were 4 huge strikes. This is like just a few years after the Great Depression had started. There were 4 huge strikes in 1934. One strike was the Minneapolis Teamsters strike. That was led by Marxists. That was led by Trotskyists, right? And it was successful, right? There was a general strike. It was 3 strikes, actually. That transformed the Teamsters Union from being a small skilled trades union into a big industrial union powerhouse, which it is today, right? That's them. Even Jimmy Hoffa, not the son, but the father, even him gave credit to Farrell Dobbs and these guys, right? Then you had the same year, 1934, you had the West Coast Longshore Strike, which was led by the Communist Party at that time. And that was a huge achievement, and that built the West Coast, the ILWU, which is still around today, the West Coast Longshore Union, and it was a huge successful general strike in San Francisco. Then you also had the Mustyites, who were like kind of radical socialists, and they later merged with the Trotskyists. They led this mass auto parts strike in Toledo, Ohio in 1934. So you had 3 big strikes that were successful. You had another strike that was led by the AFL. It wasn't led by radicals. It wasn't led by communists. But it was a massive textile strike that went from New England to the South. But that was defeated by the most ruthless means, by the way, the capitalists. They even took like what had been a German prisoner of war camp for World War I in Georgia. They used that as a concentration camp to put workers and their families in jail. I mean, this is what it took to defeat those workers, and that's what they did. But anyways, that radicalism gave birth to a split in the AFL in 1935, and you had the CIO was formed from that. And what was interesting there, too, is the founder of the leading figure in the CIO was a guy named John L. Lewis, who was the head of the Mine Workers Union, right? And John L. Lewis had fought the communists in the 20s. The Communist Party probably had 30-40% support in the miners union nationally overall. In the 20s, and he fought the communists to the end, right? And he maintained his power. But even he saw the writing on the wall of what was going on after 1934. And he said, we got to organize industry. So he creates this split, or leads a split inside the AFL. They create the CIO. And he brings in a lot of communists, right? Because he said, we need to organize the unorganized. And that's how everything changes. You see the communists start having a huge amount of influence in the CIO. For example, the UAW, I wouldn't say the UAW, the early UAW was completely led by the communists, but they had a large influence. They had people like Wyndham Mortimer played a key role in Flint, Michigan and all that. They had a lot of influence. They also didn't dominate the Steelworkers Union, but they had a lot of influence in the Steelworkers. There were other unions that really were led by the Communist Party. The Transport Workers Union here in New York, the bus and subway workers, that was Mike Quill, who was either in or around the Communist Party. He helped to create that union. You had the United Electrical Workers Union at that time was formed. They were organizing Westinghouse and General Electric, the light bulb factories, the electric appliance factory. It became a very, very large union, and a whole series of other unions as well, including the ILWU on the West Coast.
Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, absolutely. We claim those traditions and we point out that the communists built the American labor movement and formed the backbone of industrial unionism. Could you explain a little bit more the difference between the AFL and narrow trade craft unionism and what industrial unionism is?
Yeah, basically the AFL, the American Federation of Labor, most of the unions, not all, but most of the unions were formed on this basis that they would organize people by skilled trade, right? So they said we'll have the plumbers in one union, we'll have the carpenters in one union, we'll have the cigar makers in one union, that kind of stuff. Their strategy was, if we can control the supply of labor, we can constrict the supply of labor, we can raise wages and benefits for our members. So they would not only organize the skilled trades, but they would try to get everybody who was in that skilled trade to come to their apprentice schools and and they would stay within that. But the problem is to see, when you look at it from this kind of restricted play by the rules within capitalism method, there's a certain logic that takes over, which actually conflicts with the interests of the working class as a whole. Because first of all, when you're trying to constrict the supply of labor, that also means you want to limit who's going to be a member of your union. So this is how these unions became racist, or in some cases anti-immigrant, or against this ethnic group, or against that ethnic group, or against women, or whatever, because they wanted to restrict the amount of people, so that therefore the supply is restricted, and when you do supply and demand, we'll get higher wages. From a long-term interest of the working class, it's bad because it divides the working class rather than uniting the working class. That's one part of it. Another thing is they hadn't figured out, what did the capitalists do when they're faced with high wage labor for skilled trades? Then they figure out ways around that to simplify labor, because the whole mass production, the assembly line, that was a way of getting around skilled labor. When they first invented the car, they didn't have an assembly line, right? You had skilled workers who worked together to put the car together from the bottom to the top, right? It was very expensive. It's only by creating the assembly line, the masses, that's what makes it cheap. But then what you've done is you've created unskilled labor, because now a person just does one thing. They just tighten the lug nut on the right side of this wheel, and then everybody, and you're so restricted in what you're doing. It's unskilled. It could be easily you can be easily trained in how to do that. And that eliminates many skilled labor jobs, right? So you have the growth of mass production, mass industry, and all that. That needed to be organized. Industrial union is the idea that all the workers in that industry, all the workers at a particular workplace should be in one union, regardless of what they do, right? Even if you have let's say you have a couple electricians at the UAW factory, that's fine. But they should be in the UAW. They should be in that same union, So the people who are working on the line, the people who are doing the electrical maintenance, the people who sweep the floor, everybody, even the people who work in the cafeteria, should be in that union. And mass industrial unionism, when the CIO grew, was a tremendous step forward for the American working class.
Mm-hmm. And even from the point of view of winning the immediate struggle, you can see the limitations of that craft unionism, because in one same workplace, you could have all these different units. So you could have one of those unions wanting to get better wages and wanting to go on strike, but everyone else is not united around that because they're all in their own unions. They're all fighting for their own interests. They might all be, this is what happens actually, they're all getting their contracts at different times. And so what is the leverage if you're not actually shutting down the workplace. You actually don't have leverage. You see this today. Like, for example, some of the strikes that we've seen, that was one of the big strike waves last year in terms of the university workers, right? Like some of them were grad student workers or adjuncts, etc. A lot of the time, all of these are in different unions, right? The adjuncts are one union, the grad students are another union, undergrad students are another union, professors may not be unionized or they're in another union, and they're therefore not all struggling together. And so you might have a partial strike in the sense that all of the grad student workers might go on strike, but classes can continue, right? Because all of the professors are still going and whatever. Of course, you might have solidarity. Like in a lot of these cases, there was such mass support from the population and from the students and so forth. There was pressure, like some of those professors maybe just decided, okay, we're going to cancel class. But a lot of the time, what ends up happening is the strike is not successful because everything else continues just as normal. And so you can see there's still those craft unionism that still exists in the US. That's a very American thing, by the way. A lot of other countries, they don't have this. That conception of unionism doesn't exist in other countries.
Yeah, let's be clear. When we say it's quote unquote American, it's American ruling class. Yeah. It's their whole system of labor relations, and which is all done from the interest of the ruling class, which unfortunately the trade union leaders buy into. And that's why communists in the unions will push back against that, right? We say that, for example, if you want to successfully organize workers in a struggle, we need to band people together. We're going to unite. And the defeat of one union makes all the other unions weaker, makes the workers in those other unions weaker. That's why it's to our advantage to put everybody together, you know? Like at a university, you want to go into that kind of strike, let's elect a strike committee, and let's have representatives on the strike committee of all the unions, right? And let's pull this together. There are ways of uniting people and pushing back against these false rules that have been established.
My name is Chase, and I'm a landscaper at UC San Diego and a member of AFSCME Local 3299. My local organizes over 30,000 workers across the UC school and hospital system, including janitors, landscapers, and patient care employees. Because we're public employees, we work in an open shop. This means that even though the union negotiates the contract for all those employed in the departments they represent, no individual workers are actually obligated to join the union. This is because of a Supreme Court ruling a few years back, which decreed public employees aren't allowed to close shop. So we not only have to fight the UC bosses, the union bosses, but also the capitalist state. We got to recognize that the existing status quo institutions are not on our side. This is all compounded by the fact that we lack a real industrial union. My union is not the only one organizing UC workers here up and down the coast. There are actually 12 unions that organize workers at UC San Diego. If we're one workplace, then we should have one union. So when the whole workforce, or even a portion of it, needs to fight, we have the weight of the whole UC workforce behind us. But as it stands, per our contracts, none of us can strike together or take action in solidarity.
I work as a court clerk. And a few weeks ago, we were told that our workload was going to triple due to this new program that the city wants to implement. And we're being told all of this at the same time that we just had 3 people walk away from the position. So not only were we short-staffed, but we're also overworked and underpaid. And all my coworkers knew this, and they were really upset. And so I told them, do you guys want to come with me to the union meeting so we can talk about what's going on? Our supervisor had told us that we couldn't stay for the whole meeting, that we had to come back early due to the court's staffing issues. I went straight up to the union leadership before the meeting began, and I told them we have to leave early, so could we talk about our grievances first? I was told that the agenda time was for a guest speaker, not issues specific to my department. And I said in front of my coworkers, we did not come to this meeting for a guest speaker. We came to this meeting to talk about our grievances. And the leadership could sense that we weren't going to relent, and ultimately they gave us time on the floor. And to nobody's surprise, the other rank and file members reported similar issues across, their various departments, not just specific to my department, but citywide issues that the union is failing to address. I stood up and I said, what is the union doing today to address our low wages? What is the union doing today to address our working conditions? The union is 300 members strong. Why are we not using every single person in the union to make this into a fighting one? I'm willing to bet that all of my coworkers back at the courthouse will join the union today and do everything it takes to turn into a fighting one if the union leadership actually proves to us that they were willing to fight. and the union leadership had no answers for me. And ultimately, we walked away. And my coworkers were in the car, and one of them had told me, like, it sucks that we have to fight against our own union. And I said, well, we have to fight against the union leadership, which has proven itself to be conservative and cozied up with the city management. And that's the only reason why, they're even in the position to begin with, is because city management, aka the bosses, know that they're not going to ruffle any feathers. And as we got back to the courthouse, I continued telling my coworkers, like, that's why it's important for us to join the union, talk to the rank and file members, and give them the confidence and convince them that if we all work together collectively, we can push the union leadership to either expose themselves to be the ineffective leadership that they are, or force them to meet the demands of the workers, of the rank and file members. Either way, if we fight, we'll win. And two of my other coworkers were overhearing this conversation, and they asked what happened about the union meeting. And, I told them what happened. And all four of them, the two coworkers that I brought with me and the two other coworkers that heard everything that happened afterwards, all four of them submitted their applications to the union that day. It's clear that my coworkers, they're ready to stand up and fight back, and they just need this leadership. And as I continue talking to them more about, politics, about the union, about the world around us, maybe they will be convinced that, the fight for better wages and better working conditions ultimately is linked to the fight for communism.
Can we talk a little bit more about the role of the Communist Party in the trade union struggle and building the unions? You mentioned some examples from the 1930s, but I understand there was a lot of other initiatives that they took even before the rise of the CIO, right? In the 1920s, especially things like the Trade Union Education League, the International Labor Defense. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, the Communist Party was formed in the United States, of course, as a byproduct of the Bolshevik Revolution, right? And communist parties were formed everywhere, and it was the revolutionary wing of the labor movement united on an international basis. And the Communist Party started two initiatives in the 1920s. One was the Trade Union Education League, and the Trade Union Education League, which was led by William Z. Foster. He had been, by the way, in the IWW. He had been a syndicalist in the past. And the Trade Union Education League was an attempt for the Communist Party to go inside the AFL and try to make the argument for industrial unionism. This is like more than 10 years before the CIO was formed, right? So that idea that we're going to organize through industrial unionism. And it also raised the political ideas. For example, raised the issue of the Soviet Union, defending the Soviet Union, which was the one worker state at that time that existed. And it was the idea that workers also need to fight politically. They need to have their own political party.
There was a very interesting example of this in Seattle, 1919. That's one of the first general strikes in the history of the U.S. where workers went on strike. Part of it was to fight for higher wages and so forth. But as I understand it, these were port workers, right? What do you call it? Like longshoremen. And part of the reason they went on strike was actually against the shipment of weapons to the Soviet Union to fight the civil war against the Bolshevik government, right? So that's a great example of the inspiration. This was the Soviet Union, the setting up of the first worker state in history really sent shockwaves throughout the world. And a lot of workers saw that as a beacon of hope for the world working class. And it's also a good example, by the way, if you look at the Palestine struggle today. The fact that there's all these shipments of weapons, U.S. imperialism is really responsible for this, along with Israel. We're the ones sending the weapons, the planes, and it's all workers who are producing that and who are shipping that, right? So that shows that's the kind of action that workers can take. You shut down the production and shipment of weapons. You shut down Israel imperialism, right? So anyway, there's a lot of good historical examples maybe people can study.
Well, that is that not the reason why nobody knows about it, right? Because the 1919 Seattle General Strike, if you study that, that's exactly what they don't want people to know about it. And just to be clear, technically speaking, the Communist Party was just being formed. The TUEL hadn't been formed yet. But exactly like you said, they found out that these weapons were being shipped to the counter-revolution in Russia, the so-called whites, right? And that's what started that strike. And also, there's another thing that's wiped out from history is, the Soviet Union never, ever attacked the United States in all the time that it it existed. But the United States did attack the Soviet Union. There were troops next to Alaska, it'd be the far east of the Soviet Union, and also in Archangel, right? There were U.S. troops in those places. But that's also not something that people really were ever told about or know much about.
Yeah. But anyway, going back to the Trade Union Education League.
Yeah. So the Trade Union Education League was outstanding in terms of like pushing for industrial unionism, organizing the unorganized, banding the workers together on an industrial basis, and politicizing the working class, explaining the connection with the Soviet Union and the need for the working class to have its own political party. You also had, around the same time, the Communist Party took the initiative of the International Labor Defense, the ILD. And the ILD was a united front effort. It was very successful, by the way. For example, non-communists were on the board of directors, like Eugene Debs, and until he passed away and all that. The ILD took on the defense of all class war prisoners, right? Because as you were mentioning before, if you try a real strike, like if you violate injunctions and you try to stop production, guess what? People get arrested and they get framed on things and they get thrown in jail, right? So you had a lot of labor people, particularly IWW people. These are people who weren't members of the Communist Party. They were in jail prior to the founding of the Communist Party. And the Communist Party, through the ILD, took up a campaign to make sure they would defend these people, that they would support them, they would send them aid, they would send aid to their family, and they would publicize what was going on. In addition to that, the Communist Party in the ILD took the lead on trying to defend anybody who was being attacked by the state. The famous or the infamous Sacco and Vanzetti trial, right, where you have two innocent Italian immigrants who were anarchists, right, who ended up being executed by the state, right? And
it was a frame-up. It was an
absolute frame-up. Absolutely, right? But who led that defense? It was the ILD, right? The ILD even went into other issues, like in the 30s, like the Scottsboro Boys, where there was an attempt to basically, hang a bunch of young black young youth in the South, based on some false charges also about rape and all this stuff, right, which was not true. The ILD stepped in and saved these people. They basically saved them from the hangman's noose, So the Communist Party had taken a lot of initiatives in labor, and it became, in the 20s, it became the largest organization on the left in the United States, and it started to increase its influence inside of labor.
You mentioned the Scottsboro Boys and how the Communist Party was basically taking up this fight against segregation and for the rights of Black people. Can you talk a little bit more about the role they played also in the trade union movement in terms of the question of integration and fighting against racism?
Sure. I do want to say this, that let's say if we're talking about the late 20s and early 30s, that the percentage of American labor that was organized was very small. Let's say it was 4 or 5%. I'd have to look it up, but it's probably something around there. And then from 1928 till around 1934-ish, it starts changing in 34, and by 35 it changed. The Communist Party had basically an ultra-left policy in the trade unions. They kind of broke. The TUEL originally was working inside the AFL, fighting for mass industrial unions. But in 1928, they kind of took an ultra-left approach, and they broke with the AFL, and they kind of set up these red trade unions.
Ultra-left meaning, like, for example, they said that the AFL was fascist, and they're saying basically like you just form your own organization separate from everything else, and you hope that workers will come because we are the revolutionary ones, and that's that. You don't want to have anything to do with those other organizations. If they're not communist, then we don't want to work with you. That kind of a mentality.
Exactly. You had if you have a union formed by communists, that's good for communists, but people who aren't communists may not want to join, right? And then by not being part of the AFL, they were in fact doing a favor to the AFL leadership, because they weren't there to bring up the critique that needed to be brought up against the AFL leaders. But the other side of this was that because you had such a small percentage of the labor force organized, the communists did take some initiative to organize the unorganized. And they didn't have a huge amount of success, but they had some success. Some of those unions were able to gain some traction. So some of that did, especially when it was in the South, they did start taking initiative on fighting Jim Crow and fighting against racism in that respect, And by the way, the TUEL had also, taken taken a correct stand in terms of fighting that. But then you had by 1934 the party policy starts to change, and in 1935 it changes, and they.
By the way, this is all as a result of Stalinism, right? Because by that point, all the communist parties around the world were basically just following the party line that was set from the Soviet bureaucracy in Russia, and whatever they said went. And so they could flip-flop and just change the policy from one day to the next, and that's what happened. It's like a 180-degree turn from an ultra-left sectarianism to opportunism, popular frontism, all of this, right?
Yeah, by 1928, you had the complete Stalinization of the Communist Party in the United States. And then when they swing to the Popular Front period, they go into the opportunists. Then they open the floodgates. The Communist Party, just like anyone else on the left, is always under the pressure of the ruling class to make compromises, to kind of go along, to accept the limits of the system. And the Popular Front kind of opened up the floodgates for that kind of thing. So you see that in round 35, the party starts to change. And whereas the Communist Party had never supported the Democrats, now they start being part of that Roosevelt New Deal coalition and saying that somehow Roosevelt is part of a progressive bourgeois and all that kind of stuff. Now, in spite of that, they did play a very good role in the trade unions. Like I said, they did play a good role in terms of organizing the CIO. There were a whole series of unions that were led by the Communist Party, founded by the Communist Party. Some of those old ultra-left unions became part of the CIO, and they grew, And wherever there were black workers who were working in industry, the CIO would organize them. So that was a good thing, that the CIO was not going to have that exclusive attitude that the AFL had. They were saying, black and white unite to fight. That was part of the perspective there. So you had a lot of that. Now, I will say this, though. There were industries, a lot of industries, where blacks either were not allowed in or they were only allowed into certain jobs. And I don't think the CIO or the Communist Party necessarily always took a very good proactive role on that.
So you mean, like, for example, if a workplace was already integrated, they would want to unionize the whole workplace together, and you're not going to discriminate if you're black or white or whatever. But, for example, in the South, if the workplace is not integrated, that you're not going to fight to integrate the workplace and unionize it.
Yeah, not just, it's in the North. In the North, there was this, like in the North, the Transport Workers Union, which as I mentioned was led by Mike Quill, who was either in or around the Communist Party. And that was I don't think there were any black workers who were like conductors or driving the subway trains at that time. And the TWU wasn't like making a big effort to try to get blacks hired into those jobs. I think maybe that starts to change maybe in the late 30s, early 40s, or during World War II. But that was, they were not in the vanguard on that. But in industries like in steel or auto, where there were already black workers, the CIO and the Communist Party did correctly organize workers together.
The Communist Party was supporting the Democratic Party, right? Which, by the way, at the time, that was still the party of the old slave owners. It was the racist party, actually, the party of the South. So that's telling. And they support the New Deal, and they support FDR. And what was the consequence of that?
And that policy more or less went from the mid-1930s until after World War II, with the exception of the fall of 1939 till June 1941, because in the fall of 1939, there's the Hitler-Stalin Pact. Then the Communist parties made some change in their policy, broke a little bit from that Popular Front. And then in June 1941, Hitler invades the Soviet Union, back to the Popular Front policy. That policy undermines the Communist Party, because particularly in World War II, the capitalist class made tons of money off World War II, tons of profits, but they worked the working class to the bone, right? The working class had to work double shift, triple shift, 7 days a week and whatever, and they were subjected to wage freezes and rationing and all that. So as a result of that, who was responsible for speed ups? Who was responsible for enforcing the no strike pledge? Because this was the other thing. The capitalists wanted no strikes in the war. They said, it's too important. You can't strike. Who was part of the role of enforcing those no strikes? The Communist Party. So the Communist Party became an arm of the bosses in World War II. And as a result, that created resentment that would later play against them later on, right? Another problem, too, that undermined them was during the Popular Front. Even though they played a prominent role in the labor movement, a lot of times they didn't say they were communists. Their politics reflected FDR liberalism, so people had no way of distinguishing
So
them.
they're waving the American flag, not the red flag, right?
That's
Just
right.
pandering to that.
That's right. And then what ends up happening is that when they get attacked after World War II and say, oh, these are communists, they were secret. They wormed their way into that leadership and they didn't tell you they were communists. A lot of workers were surprised. A lot of workers felt betrayed by that.
They support the New Deal, FDR. And that's around the time that the NLRB gets started, right?
Yes.
Which was actually, a lot of people have this false idea that FDR was progressive, that the New Deal was this very big progressive thing, and therefore that the NLRB that was set up also is somehow a worker-friendly institution that serves workers' interests. But in reality, these things were set up to cut across a wave of class struggle. And so what ended up happening then is those unions cave in.
The NLRB, exactly, right? The Wagner Act, and which was the law that establishes that. What happened is there was all these drives by the working class to fight to build unions. Like I mentioned, the struggles in the 34 and the struggles afterwards. And the success that built the UAW wasn't a national labor relations vote, by the way. It was a plant occupation, and they occupied that plant from the end of December, beginning of January, till I think the end of February or March. So that's what built the unions. And then a whole series of plant occupations happened after the success of that. That's what organized it. It wasn't the NLRB. It wasn't having elections. But that's exactly like you said. The whole idea of the NLRB is they don't want people to occupy factories and they don't want sit-down strikes. What they want you to do is sign a card and wait for a government bureaucracy to come by and, quote, run an election. And then when they run the election, if you win, then they say, okay, then you can have a union. So in other words, you have to wait for the government to grant you the right to have a trade union? No. Every worker has a right to join a trade union, period. And then they should demand that the boss recognize their trade union.
And so you can see this is the origin, basically the beginning of the end in a sense, because once you accept these institutions, you accept the NLRB, and then you had the post-war economic boom, and that's where you start to see the declining level of class consciousness and class struggle, and also the entire Marxist movement, the communist movement gets thrown way back, right? After the war ends, you do have massive strikes, for example, in 1946, but then from there, it starts to go downhill, and you have all these anti-union laws, like we mentioned Taft-Hartley earlier, that was passed in 1947.
The attack on the labor movement went hand in hand with the Red Scare, which starts right after World War II, right? Because the American ruling class is worried that, the Soviet Union is the force that beat Hitler, right? Mm-hmm. And of course, they expanded a buffer zone in Eastern Europe, and then you saw the Chinese Revolution happens in 1949. The Colonial Revolution is rising up. Like you said, you had that huge wave of strikes in 1946. You also had a lot of movements by American soldiers and sailors, right? I think the United States at one point in World War II had like 12 million people in arms, right? And they say, we want to go home. The United States imperialists wanted to maybe use them against the Soviet Union, use them against the colonial revolution, but they said, no, we want to go home. There was mass movements. They had to bring these people home. So as a counterattack, the U.S. starts the Red Scare, right? And like the Taft-Hartley Act itself is both anti-communist and anti-union. And part of the problem here, again, is the Communist Party had undermined itself by supporting the war effort in World War II. That was one. But the other thing is when they started getting attacked, instead of pushing back, instead of saying, yes, we are communists, and you're attacking us because we fight for a shorter work week with no loss in pay and free health care, instead of coming back, they had a couple of different strategies. One strategy was to kind of put weaker anti-communist resolutions in the trade unions instead of we'll fight the stronger anti-communists with a weaker. I mean, it's just absolutely bizarre. And then the other thing, of course, is they get hauled in front of these committees and then they start pleading the fifth, which made them look like the mafia, right? Are you a communist? I plead the fifth, The thing is, you have to fight back politically. If you give an inch to the enemy class, they're only going to throw you back even more. So this, and then like you said, there were concrete conditions of the destruction of World War II, which gave a new lease on life to capitalism, which I recommend any of your listeners want to read more about that. They should read Ted Grant's "Will There Be a Slump?" Explains why there was a post-World War II boom, and that of course created those conditions. But then you see that once they purged the left from the trade unions, there's a relative weakening of the trade unions, not an absolute weakening. There's a relative weakening of the trade unions from the late 40s to the early 70s. Then once you have the end of the post-war boom, and then the capitalists go on the offensive, then you have a real weakening of the trade unions.
Mm-hmm. And we end up in the situation today where 10% of the entire workforce is in a union. In the private sector, it's 6%. And actually, the share of the workforce that is unionized is falling every year, right? Like by very little, but I think in 2022, it was 10.1%. And last year, it went down to 10% in terms of the share of the workforce that is unionized. So we would argue as communists, when we talk about reclaiming the traditions of the earlier period of the labor movement, of the role that the communists played in that as well. We also understand that we have the forces that we have. There isn't a mass communist party in this country. We're trying to build a communist party. That's what the meaning is of the launch of the Revolutionary Communists of America. So we have to start from where we are and try to find other co-workers that are interested in the idea, build the nucleus of what could become a left-wing current within the union so we can argue for these methods more effectively. So yeah, wherever we have comrades, we want to spread the ideas, spread class struggle ideas, and also find those who are interested in communism so we can grow the influence, have bigger communist cells that we can have a larger and larger impact.
My name is Nick Remmel. I am a revolutionary communist for the RCA. I live here in the DFW, and for my job, I work as a merchandiser for a beer distributor. The store I'm going to talk about today is the Walmart I work at. I've had conversations with a few people. One is a young worker. He's very interested in the ideas, but he's a little hesitant to get involved. That being said, he's bought The Communist issue number 1, number 2, number 3, an RCI manifesto, and IDOM 45. The moment when things really changed was at that Walmart. A Walmart employee died at the store. It was detailed in issue number 2. So when it was published in issue number 2, I took that paper to Jay, and I told him and another coworker who was there in the back, the story that had happened. I wrote a report, and now it's in this paper I'm holding right in front of them. And I sold that paper to the both of them, and that was really a shift in how Jay and I talked with each other. After that, Marxism was no longer something we talked about sometimes. It's really what we talked about all the time now. There has to be a conscious effort. I've noticed a serious fault of mine has been a lack of conscious effort. I'll discuss the ideas with people sporadically and in a casual manner, similar to any other casual conversation at work, like you're talking about the football game. But that's not enough, especially when there's serious opportunity. Notes should be taken. What was discussed? What are they interested in? What's their seriousness, etc.? With that, consistent effort in starting and advancing these conversations. When these more casual conversations reach their natural limit, recommend literature on the topics to elevate the theoretical level. We should also be more bold. We shouldn't just limit ourselves to talking to our work buddies. At Walmart, there's a whole bunch of young workers like Jay who should be talked to whenever possible. These interested workers we find can also be the starting point for leaflets. The report that was in issue number 2 was really a turning point for Jay, and I don't see why efforts like leaflets and things like that can't be a turning point for a number of workers on possibly a larger scale. As Marxists, we have to consider more than the current moment and tasks. We have to consider the later stages of this process, the events that will take place, and how do we prepare for those? Whether those events that we're preparing for are in the workplace, our city, our nation, or the world, that's the duty of a trained revolutionary, is to prepare for all these things, to build the forces necessary to actually capture the potential of these events.
Any genuine communist should come to our Congress that's going to happen at the end of July. You don't want to miss this. Be a part of the democratic process of building the organization, which is going to build more and more of these cells in workplaces, in schools, neighborhoods, anywhere where we can build